In February 2009, a woman walking her dog in Albuquerque stumbled upon something horrifying buried in the desert sand. What began as a simple bone discovery turned into one of the largest serial murder cases in New Mexico's history. 11 women, all missing, all buried in the same desert graveyard. Who was the killer, and why has the West Mesa bone collector never been caught? It was an ordinary afternoon on February 2, 2009, in Albuquerque, New Mexico. The skies stretched wide and cloudless, the kind of dry winter day that locals knew well. A woman named Christine Ross had taken her dog, Ruka, out for a walk along a barren stretch of land on the West Mesa. The desert was harsh but familiar, flat earth, scattered shrubs, and the outline of the Sandia Mountains rising in the distance. As Ruka sniffed around, he suddenly darted off the trail and began digging furiously in the dirt. Christine called out, thinking he had found a bone from some small animal. But when she walked closer, her breath caught. Protruding from the ground was what looked disturbingly like a human bone. At first she hesitated. Could it be a deer? A coyote? But the more she stared, the more the truth sank in. This wasn't animal. This was human. Christine quickly dialed 911, her voice shaking as she tried to explain what her dog had just unearthed. Within hours, police officers, forensic teams, and crime scene investigators swarmed the desert patch. What they uncovered over the following days would shock not only Albuquerque, but the entire nation. The police cordoned off the area, and excavation began. Slowly, carefully, teams of forensic anthropologists brushed away layers of dirt. With each scoop of soil, more bones surfaced. First one set, then another, then another. By the end of that first week, the West Mesa Desert was no longer just barren land. It had become a mass graveyard. Authorities eventually recovered the remains of 11 women and one unborn child. Most had been buried years earlier, their skeletons hidden beneath layers of sand and desert brush. The victims had vanished between 2001 and 2005, their disappearances barely making headlines at the time. Now all of them were together, unearthed from shallow graves by pure accident. The media swarmed in, dubbing the unknown perpetrator the West Mesa Bone Collector. Helicopters flew overhead, capturing the haunting sight of white tents, search crews, and cadaver dogs crisscrossing the desert floor. Families who had long reported missing daughters, sisters, or mothers rushed to the site, hoping against hope that maybe their loved ones were not among the dead. But as the DNA testing and identification process unfolded, the cruel reality emerged. These women were indeed the missing persons that their families had begged authorities to find years earlier. For many families, the West Mesa gave them closure, but for others, it ripped open old wounds in the most brutal way. In the months that followed, what began with a woman walking her dog escalated into one of the largest homicide investigations in New Mexico history. The desert had given up its dead, but it had not revealed their killer. The question that haunted everyone was simple, yet chilling. Who buried 11 women in the West Mesa, and how had they gotten away with it for so long? When the first skeletons were carefully lifted from the West Mesa soil, the mystery wasn't just about how they died, but also who they were. Over months of painstaking forensic work, matching dental records, DNA profiles, and missing persons reports, the 11 victims were finally identified. The women shared hauntingly similar backgrounds. Most struggled with addiction, poverty, and unstable housing. Many were involved in sex work, often disappearing without anyone outside their families raising alarm. In the early 2000s, Albuquerque was gripped by drug epidemics and violence, and women from vulnerable communities, especially those on the margins of society, were at constant risk. For some families, the West Mesa discovery explained years of heartbreak. Julie Nieto's mother, Eleanor, remembered filing police reports and pleading for help after her daughter went missing in 2004. She felt that nobody truly cared because of her daughter's lifestyle. Now seeing Julie's name among the dead was both devastating and validating. "I knew something bad happened to her," Eleanor said, "but nobody listened." Two of the victims were heartbreakingly young. Jamie Barella, just 15 years old, had gone out one afternoon with her cousin Evelyn Salazar, and neither returned. Evelyn's unborn child became the 12th victim at West Mesa, a chilling reminder of just how indiscriminate the killer's cruelty was. The media coverage painted the women as drug addicts or prostitutes, but their families fought hard to change the narrative. These women were daughters, sisters, and mothers. They had people who loved them. Some had been trying to get clean, to start fresh. Their families insisted they should be remembered not as statistics, but as lives stolen too soon. The most striking victim was Selenia Edwards, only 15 years old, who wasn't even from New Mexico. She was a runaway from Oklahoma who had somehow ended up in Colorado before vanishing. How she crossed paths with the West Mesa killer remains one of the most baffling aspects of the case. What united them all was vulnerability. They lived on society's edge, where predators lurked, and law enforcement often overlooked missing persons reports. The bone collector seemed to know this. He targeted women whose disappearances would cause little public outcry, burying them in shallow graves in a place where no one was supposed to look. By the time their remains were discovered in 2009, the victims had been gone for nearly a decade. Their bones told only fragments of their stories: broken teeth, old injuries, hints of a life lived hard. The desert had silenced them, but their names on the memorial wall in Albuquerque's West Mesa Memorial Park remind the city and the world that they mattered. The question lingered louder than ever. If the victims had been protected, listened to, and valued, would the West Mesa bone collector have been stopped before claiming 11 lives? The discovery of the West Mesa graves in 2009 set off one of the largest homicide investigations in New Mexico's history. Detectives from the Albuquerque Police Department, APD, the FBI, and even the DEA pooled resources to hunt for the person who had buried 11 women in the desert. But from the very beginning, investigators faced a cruel reality. The killer was already years ahead of them. The remains showed that most of the victims had disappeared between 2001 and 2005, meaning the crimes had gone unnoticed for nearly a decade. By the time police reached the Mesa, the killer's trail was cold. Bones weathered by years of sun and wind made it difficult to establish exact causes of death. No bullets, no ligatures, no definitive murder weapons, just skeletons silently holding secrets. Still, investigators refused to stop. They combed through thousands of missing person reports from the early 2000s, re-interviewed families, and reopened cold case files. Detectives reconstructed the lives of the victims, searching for patterns, where they had last been seen, who they associated with, and whether anyone had threatened them. One chilling pattern emerged. Most of the victims had vanished from Albuquerque's East Central Avenue corridor, an area notorious for sex work, drug activity, and violent crime. Detectives theorized that the killer likely prowled that neighborhood, picking up women who were vulnerable and unlikely to be reported missing right away. APD set up a dedicated West Mesa task force with over 40 investigators working the case. They knocked on doors, interviewed pimps, drug dealers, and sex workers, and followed every rumor that spread through Albuquerque's underground. Informants whispered about men who preyed on women, who picked them up and never returned them. Some names came up again and again. One suspect was a former Albuquerque resident with a violent criminal history. Another was linked to human trafficking rings. There were even whispers of a serial predator who had left New Mexico entirely, possibly moving to Texas or elsewhere. Detectives were overwhelmed by the sheer number of leads, but none produced enough hard evidence for an arrest. The FBI offered assistance, bringing in behavioral profilers. The profilers painted a disturbing picture. The killer was methodical, patient, and deeply familiar with Albuquerque's hidden corners. He likely knew the West Mesa well, perhaps a construction worker, truck driver, or someone who lived nearby. The desert burial site suggested someone with the strength and time to dig graves and the confidence to believe they wouldn't be discovered. Detectives also looked into satellite images. Remarkably, aerial photos taken years earlier showed disturbed soil on the mesa, consistent with graves being dug between 2001 and 2005. This gave investigators a rough timeline of when the killings occurred, but it still didn't give them a face or a name. As the investigation dragged on, frustration grew. Families of the victims held vigils, demanding justice. Many accused law enforcement of not taking the disappearances seriously when they first happened. If they had acted sooner, some argued, maybe our daughters wouldn't have ended up in the desert. By 2010, the case had made national headlines. The media dubbed the unknown killer the West Mesa Bone Collector. The haunting nickname only deepened the fear and fascination surrounding the case. Despite endless tips, dozens of interviews, and multiple suspects considered, the bone collector seemed to vanish as completely as his victims once had. Even now, years later, the case remains unsolved. Detectives insist they are closer than the public knows, but without that one critical piece of evidence, a confession, a DNA match, or a credible witness, the mystery lingers like the desert wind that first uncovered the bones. The biggest question remained: was the bone collector still out there, watching, waiting, and perhaps even hunting again? As the investigation into the West Mesa bone collector deepened, police and the public began circling around possible suspects and theories. While none have been definitively tied to the murders, several names and possibilities have loomed large in the case for over a decade. One of the earliest and most prominent suspects was Lorenzo Montoya, a man living not far from the West Mesa site. Montoya had a long history of violence against women, particularly sex workers. In December 2006, just months after investigators believed the last of the West Mesa victims disappeared, Montoya was killed in a violent confrontation. He had strangled a young woman he lured to his home, and when her boyfriend caught him trying to dispose of her body, Montoya was shot dead. Many detectives believed this could explain why the murders stopped after 2005. Montoya had the means, the violent history, and the proximity to the burial site. Still, without direct forensic evidence, his guilt could never be confirmed. Another theory focused on trafficking networks in Albuquerque. Several of the victims were last seen in areas controlled by pimps and drug dealers, raising the possibility that the murders were tied to organized crime. Some speculated that the bone collector might not have been a single killer at all, but rather multiple men involved in exploiting women who then disposed of them in the same desolate stretch of Mesa. This theory, while unsettling, could explain the lack of consistency in timelines and patterns. A different suspect emerged when police examined ties to serial predators in nearby states. One man in particular, connected to violent crimes against women in Texas and Colorado, was investigated. He was known to have traveled through New Mexico during the early 2000s. The FBI looked into him extensively, but again, no solid link to the West Mesa victims was found. Some investigators also considered a law enforcement connection. The burial site was remote, difficult to find, and required knowledge of the landscape. Could the killer have been someone with tactical knowledge, or even someone in uniform who made the women feel safe enough to approach? While no evidence has surfaced to back this claim, the theory has lingered in public speculation. Perhaps the most haunting theory is that the bone collector has never stopped killing, just changed locations. After 2005, women continued to go missing in Albuquerque and surrounding areas, though not all fit the same profile as the West Mesa victims. Could the killer have moved operations to a new burial ground, one not yet uncovered? This chilling possibility keeps families and investigators vigilant, fearing the case is far from over. The frustrating truth is that each suspect, Montoya, traffickers, interstate predators, has pieces that fit the puzzle, but none that complete it. The lack of forensic evidence has left the case stuck in the shadows. Detectives admit privately that they may already know the bone collector's name, but without proof, the man who buried 11 women in the desert remains a phantom. And so the theories continue to swirl. A violent loner, a trafficker, a drifter, a predator hiding in plain sight. But the most important question remains unanswered. Who was he, and why did he stop? While the case of the West Mesa bone collector has baffled detectives and gripped the public, the deepest pain has always rested with the families of the victims. For them, the discovery of the graves in 2009 was not just a shocking news story, it was the end of years of agonizing uncertainty. Most of the women had been missing for years before their remains were found, their families living through the endless cycle of hope and heartbreak that accompanies a loved one's disappearance. The families, many from struggling communities in Albuquerque, often felt their daughters and sisters were dismissed because of their lifestyles. Most of the victims were sex workers, some battling addiction, and their disappearances were not always taken seriously at first. Parents recall filing missing person reports only to feel brushed aside. "They told me she probably just ran off," one mother later said in interviews. "But I knew my daughter. I knew something was wrong." When the bones were unearthed, those long-ignored voices finally gained weight. Mothers, sisters, and children of the victims demanded justice, insisting their loved ones not be reduced to statistics. They held vigils, marched in Albuquerque, and spoke to local media, reminding the world that each set of bones belonged to a real woman, with dreams, laughter, and a family who still grieved. "She was somebody's baby," one sister said, clutching a candle during a vigil. In the years since, these families have carried the case forward. Some partnered with advocacy groups to push for more attention to missing women, particularly those in vulnerable communities. Others stayed in close contact with detectives, refusing to let the case go cold. Their persistence has ensured the West Mesa murders remain in public memory, even as the official investigation struggles with dead ends. For the children left behind, the trauma lingers. Several of the victims were mothers, and their children grew up with the shadow of loss. Some are now adults, still searching for closure, still hoping the killer will one day be named. "We can't move on until we know who did this," one victim's daughter said years later. Despite the grief, the family's unity has created a quiet strength. They have turned their pain into a call for change, demanding better protection for vulnerable women and stronger resources for missing persons cases. In many ways, they have become the most powerful voices in the story of the West Mesa bone collector, refusing to let their loved ones vanish a second time, this time into silence and forgetfulness. But justice remains elusive. For every vigil, every interview, every tear shed under the desert sun, the families still ask the same haunting question: when will we know the truth? The West Mesa murders have left behind a chilling legacy that continues to echo through Albuquerque and beyond. More than just a criminal mystery, The case revealed the dangerous intersections of poverty, vulnerability, and systemic neglect. These women were not only victims of a killer, they were victims of a society that too often overlooked them until it was too late. For the city of Albuquerque, the discovery of those mass graves in 2009 was a turning point. Overnight, the desert outskirts became synonymous with one of the largest unsolved serial killer cases in American history. The site itself, once an unremarkable stretch of dirt and brush, has since become a grim memorial. Small crosses, flowers, and personal tokens mark the place where 11 women and an unborn child were found. Families, activists, and even strangers come there to remember, mourn, and demand answers. Culturally, the case highlighted the risks faced by marginalized women, especially sex workers, in communities across the U.S. Advocacy groups often cite the West Mesa murders when pushing for more comprehensive protections for women in dangerous circumstances. The tragedy helped shift conversations around how law enforcement handles missing persons reports, particularly when the victim comes from vulnerable backgrounds. The case also continues to fascinate true crime researchers, journalists, and amateur sleuths. Documentaries, podcasts, and articles revisit the story regularly, keeping public attention alive. Each retelling serves both as a warning and as a reminder that the killer or killers have never been brought to justice. This ongoing interest has ensured that the West Mesa victims are not forgotten, even as the years pass. The unresolved nature of the murders remains the heaviest part of the legacy. For the families, justice delayed feels indistinguishable from justice denied. The unanswered questions: who buried them? Why were they targeted? Was there more than one killer? Haunt both the loved ones of the victims and the community as a whole. In the end, the legacy of the West Mesa bone collector is one of remembrance and persistence. 11 women, once dismissed and ignored, are now permanently etched into the history of Albuquerque. Their story is a warning of what happens when society looks away, but also a testament to the families and advocates who refuse to stop searching for the truth. And so, the desert still whispers. Until the day someone answers for these crimes, the case of the West Mesa bone collector will remain not just a local tragedy, but one of America's most enduring and unsettling mysteries.